the brutal truth about stagecoach travel that Hollywood left out. Have you ever lost yourself in a classic Western movie, perhaps marveling at those magnificent stagecoaches? Hollywood paints a thrilling, adventurous, and often romantic picture. But what if I told you that Hollywood's depiction of stagecoach travel is mostly a fantasy, far from the exciting, sometimes seemingly comfortable journeys we see on screen? Today, we're going to peel back the cinematic romance to uncover the harsh, uncomfortable, and incredibly dangerous reality of 19th century stagecoach travel. You'll discover a world of toil and suffering, relentless discomfort, and threats that went far beyond a dramatic shootout. This video will give you a profound look into what our ancestors truly endured, and perhaps help you understand why the real story of stagecoach travel is even more compelling than the legends. Hollywood's frontier fantasy versus the cruel conveyance. When we think of stagecoach journeys, our minds are immediately drawn to captivating images from the big screen. Hollywood, with its storytelling prowess, has transformed the stagecoach into an icon of adventure and romance on the wild frontier. Think back to classics like John Ford's Stagecoach, where diverse characters, each with their own story, are brought together on a perilous adventure. In those films, the stagecoach itself often appears quite spacious, like a mobile stage, allowing characters to converse, interact, and for human drama to unfold. These cinematic journeys promise breathtaking suspense, daring chases, dramatic robberies, or moving moments of heroic sacrifice. The stagecoach isn't just a mode of transport, it becomes a mobile stage for human tragedy and triumph, where destinies intertwine, fiery confrontations take place, and stories of survival are written within its cramped confines. However, the brutal reality was a world away from the glamorous vision Hollywood painted. These films rarely depicted the persistent suffering, a harsh truth that most 19th century stagecoach passengers faced. Instead of focusing on the chronic misery caused by terrible road conditions, extreme and prolonged discomfort, pervasive dust, and the constant fear of illness and fatal accidents, Hollywood prioritized sudden ambushes and swift gunfights. The romanticization of stagecoach travel played a significant role in building the myth of a young, adventurous nation, transforming a symbol of arduous expansion into an emblem of rugged individualism and the pioneer spirit. But the truth is, the actual stagecoach experience was something modern people would find almost unbearable. It wasn't a scenic ride. It was a grueling physical and mental ordeal, a challenging journey that few of us today can fully imagine. Let's dive into those brutal details. The Concord Discomfort, coach built for endurance, not ease. When it comes to 19th century American stagecoaches, it's impossible not to mention the Concord coach. This was the most iconic stagecoach, developed in the 1820s and quickly becoming the backbone of the overland transportation system. Its design was incredibly sturdy and reliable, to the point that it remained virtually unchanged for nearly 75 years. But don't let its durable appearance fool you, because durability did not mean comfort. A distinguishing feature of the Concord coach was its innovative leather strap suspension system. Instead of rigid metal springs, the coach body was suspended on thick leather straps, allowing it to sway as it moved. This was supposed to provide a smoother ride than older coaches, especially on the relatively better roads in the eastern U.S. However, smooth here was a relative term, and this comfort virtually disappeared when the coach ventured onto the rough, bumpy trails of the Wild West. The famous writer Mark Twain, who experienced these journeys, even recounted a memorable anecdote. One of the suspension straps broke under the weight of heavy mail bags, proving the harshness of the journey. But what truly horrified passengers entering a Concord coach was the terrible cramped space. Concord coaches were typically designed to carry 6, 9, or 12 passengers inside. In reality, however, many more were often crammed in, with people even riding on the roof or clinging to the sides to find extra room. Inside, the space was incredibly tight. The passenger compartment was only slightly over 1.2 meters, about 4 feet, wide, and approximately 1.37 meters, about 4.5 feet, high. Imagine being squeezed shoulder to shoulder, knee to knee with complete strangers in such a stuffy and suffocating space. Mark Twain, with his sharp satirical style, described passengers being mixed up a little by the swaying of the coach, finding themselves piled up in front. He also humorously recounted that sometimes passengers were actually standing on our heads due to the continuous and violent jolts of the coach. This illustrates the extreme chaos and discomfort passengers endured. To make matters worse, coaches in the West, especially those frequently facing extremely rough roads, had to replace glass windows with roll-down leather or canvas curtains. The reason was simple. The violent shaking constantly shattered the glass. This meant passengers had less protection from dust, rain, and extreme temperatures. On a long journey, being assaulted by swirling dust or enduring cold rain splashing on you was certainly an ordeal. Additionally, mail, a primary and important item transported by stagecoach companies, was often piled inside the passenger compartment, further reducing the already cramped space, making the experience even more suffocating and uncomfortable. The Concord coach, while a marvel of engineering for its time, relied heavily on the stamina and endurance of those who rode it. One traveler described being bounced now on the hard seat, now against the roof, and now against the side of the coach. He added that this was no joke, emphasizing the discomfort and pain each passenger experienced on every mile of the journey. This was not a mode of transport for relaxation or enjoying the scenery, but a machine that tested human endurance. Are we there yet? The torturous truth of the journey itself. The romantic image of a stagecoach gliding through picturesque landscapes across vast prairies or majestic mountains quickly fades when we confront the harsh reality of the journey itself. The main reason was the abysmal road conditions in the 19th century, which turned any trip into a true test of endurance. Roads in the American West were often just primitive dirt tracks, and they were entirely at the mercy of extreme weather. The rainy season would transform them into deeply rutted, muddy streams, causing wheels to get stuck and the coach to lurch endlessly. The dry season brought thick, pervasive clouds of dust, covering everything and everyone, making breathing difficult. When winter arrived, heavy snow could block all roads, making travel almost impossible. Another notorious type of road passengers endured was the corduroy road. Imagine logs laid side by side over muddy ground, creating an uneven and extremely bumpy surface. The great writer Charles Dickens, who experienced this type of road, described riding on such a road as causing jolts enough to dislocate all the bones. It's truly difficult to imagine the sensation of your entire body being thrown up, slammed down, and constantly battered for hours, even days, on end. And not only were the roads terrible, but the pace of travel was agonizingly slow, like crawling. An average stagecoach could only travel about 8 to 19 kilometers per hour, 5 to 12 miles per hour, on the best stretches of road. Sometimes, in difficult terrain, they only managed a mere 11 to 19 kilometers per day. Think about it. A journey that today takes us just a few hours by car could then last 3 full days by stagecoach. The consequence of this snail's pace, combined with the rough terrain, was continuous, relentless, violent motion. This led to total body exhaustion, bruises all over, and an unending sense of bone-deep weariness. This situation was made even worse by severe overcrowding. Passengers were crammed into the small interior compartment, to the point where there wasn't an inch of space left. Additionally, mailbags piled inside not only took up space, but also became uncomfortable objects, hitting passengers every time the coach jolted. And most terrifying of all was the very little escape from the harsh external environment. Whether it was extreme heat scorching the skin, choking dust obscuring vision, biting cold, pouring rain drenching everything, or constant insect harassment, passengers had to endure it all. There was no air conditioning, no sealed windows, no air filtration system. They were completely exposed to the mercilessness of nature. One of the most horrifying aspects of long-distance stagecoach travel was the non-stop journey. Trips could last continuously for 22 days, day and night, without a single moment of true rest. Imagine a journey from St. Louis to San Francisco, one of the longest routes, taking about 25 arduous days. Throughout that time, passengers faced poor quality food and no proper sleep. Stops were usually very brief, primarily just to change fresh horses, allowing passengers enough time to stretch their legs a bit before continuing the journey. Sometimes, passengers were even forced to walk to lighten the load for tired horse teams, or had to get out and help push the coach up steep inclines. The entire journey was a constant assault on multiple senses, a physical and mental wearing down, pushing people to the limits of their endurance. After hearing about these terrible roads and slow speeds, what about the stagecoach journey surprised or disturbed you most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Surviving the stops, way stations and refreshments. Against the backdrop of a prolonged and grueling journey, the brief stops at way stations should have been a welcome respite, an opportunity to rest and refuel. However, in reality, they offered very little true relief, and sometimes even added to the trip's discomfort. There were two main types of stations: swing stations and home stations. Swing stations were basic, as their name suggests, simply places to change fresh horses for the coach. Here, the stopover time was extremely brief, just enough for staff to unhitch the old horses and replace them with fresher ones. There was no time for passengers to rest or eat. Home stations were a bit more significant. They were often private homes or small inns, sometimes just makeshift shacks in the wilderness. Here, they served meals and provided crude lodging for passengers. However, even at these home stations, rest time was still very short. For example, the Butterfield Overland Mail stagecoach lines, one of the largest services at the time, stopped for a mere 10 minutes at each station. 10 minutes was not enough time to do anything but hastily get off the coach, try to grab some food, and then rush back on the road. The quality of the food at these stations was one of the most common complaints and a horror for most passengers. The proprietors, knowing that passengers had no other options, exploited their monopolistic position. They often served poor quality food, sometimes spoiled or carelessly cooked, but charged arbitrary, often very high prices. Granville Stewart, who endured many such journeys, bitterly lamented, "Every meal was the same." The typical menu was usually very bland and meager, consisting of hard bacon, dry ham, and a dreadful, almost inedible dry apple pie. There were no fresh vegetables, no truly nutritious or appealing dishes. For this reason, some wise and prepared passengers brought their own food to avoid facing these terrible meals. Hygiene was another major concern. Travelers, especially Victorians who were accustomed to higher hygiene standards, were appalled by the filthy and unsanitary conditions at the way stations. They were shocked by the careless attitude towards cleanliness from the innkeepers and cooks. There's a famous anecdote about a station cook who, after petting a dirty animal, immediately plunged his hands into biscuit dough to prepare a meal without washing them. When a passenger, unable to bear it, complained about dirt in the food, the innkeeper retorted curtly and rudely, "Everyone should eat a bushel of dirt." The dry-witted traveler replied that he didn't want to eat his entire ration in one meal. Such stories clearly show the horrific lack of hygiene and disrespect towards passengers. Accommodations at the way stations were also extremely primitive and lacking amenities. Women often had to crowd into a single room, with no privacy. Men had it even worse. often sleeping 2 to a bed, sometimes even 3 or 4 to a bed, with complete strangers. Beds were frequently filthy, infested with bed bugs, and not regularly cleaned. These stopping points, which should have offered rest, often became another layer of brutality in the journey, leaving passengers more uncomfortable and tired rather than refreshed. The unspoken horrors, sanitation and sickness on the trail. Beyond the obvious discomforts of roads, coaches, and food, there were far more silent yet deadly horrors. The issues of personal hygiene and rampant disease on stagecoach journeys. First, let's talk about basic personal hygiene. Addressing personal needs was a significant and embarrassing challenge, as no restrooms were equipped on the stagecoach. When nature called, passengers could only relieve themselves by the roadside, with very little or almost no privacy. Throughout a long journey lasting days, sometimes weeks, personal hygiene became an unattainable dream. Facilities at the way stations were also extremely primitive. Personal washing was often done at horse troughs, afar from sanitary place. Worse yet, at one end of the trough, a shared cup, towel, and toothbrush were often provided for everyone. Imagine a single cup and toothbrush used by dozens, even hundreds of strangers every day, with no soap or clean water for disinfection. This left passengers in a significantly dirty state, not only their clothes and bodies, but also at high risk of disease transmission. But the most brutal, and also the #1 killer on the trails, was disease and serious illness. Sadly, disease caused the death of up to 9 out of 10 pioneers on overland journeys. Among these diseases, cholera was a terrifying, invisible destroyer. It spread primarily through contaminated water, which was very common given the poor sanitary conditions of way stations and water sources along the route. Cholera often led to rapid death due to severe dehydration, sometimes within just 24 hours of the first symptoms appearing. In addition to cholera, dysentery was also a common and severely debilitating illness. It caused bloody diarrhea and high fever, rapidly weakening the body. Other diseases that ravaged stagecoach travelers included typhoid fever, measles, influenza, tuberculosis, and mountain fever. All of these diseases spread easily in a crowded, unsanitary environment where passengers' bodies were weakened by the arduous journey. Clearly, crowded coaches and unsanitary stations were ideal breeding grounds for pathogens. Bacteria and viruses could spread rapidly from person to person in the confined space of the coach, or through the shared use of utensils and contaminated water sources at the way stations. What made the situation even more hopeless was that there was virtually no effective medical support along the way. Pioneers had to rely entirely on inadequate home remedies, often folk cures or superstitions, which were powerless against deadly diseases. Furthermore, understanding of germ theory in the 19th century was very limited. Doctors and the public often blamed diseases on miasmas or bad air rather than bacteria or viruses. This lack of scientific understanding rendered prevention and treatment measures ineffective, pushing passengers into a vicious cycle of sickness and death. The real perils of the prairie, beyond Hollywood's gunfights. Hollywood often focuses on epic shootouts, dramatic confrontations between heroes and villains, but in reality, the most frequent and often deadliest dangers were far more mundane. Accidents, mechanical breakdowns, and the grim reality of robbery. Accidents occurred with alarming frequency, wheels suddenly falling off, horses losing control and stampeding, or brakes failing causing the coach to careen downhill. All were common sights on stagecoach routes. When a coach broke down mid-journey, passengers were often stranded in the middle of nowhere, waiting for help that might never arrive. The causes of these accidents were diverse, from unbelievably bad roads to mechanical failures like collapsed wheels or broken axles. Driver error was also a significant factor, such as speeding on dangerous terrain or being intoxicated while driving. Horses could also become unpredictable, suddenly spooking or becoming disobedient. And river crossings were always a hazard, with collapsed bridges or swift currents that could sweep away the entire coach. Among all these accidents, coach rollovers were perhaps the most dangerous aspect. With a high center of gravity and unstable construction, stagecoaches were very prone to overturning, especially when traveling on rough, steep, or sharp, curving roads. The consequences of a rollover were often severe injuries like broken bones, concussions, or even instant death. Many passengers never reached their destination due to these tragic accidents. Besides accidents, stagecoach robbery was also a constant threat. Wells Fargo coaches, one of the largest transport companies at the time, were robbed nearly 350 times between 1870 and 1884. Robbers often ambushed coaches at points where they had to slow down, such as on steep hills, around blind curves, or in narrow sections of road. The level of violence in robberies varied. Many robbers avoided killing to avoid more intense pursuit, but sometimes brutal murders still occurred. The main targets of robbers were treasure boxes containing gold, silver, and cash, along with mail bags, which often contained valuable documents and checks. Some famous robbers like Black Bart were known for their polite demeanor, sometimes leaving poems at the scene of the crime, while others were crude, uneducated, and brutal. To counter robberies, stagecoach companies implemented various security measures, including assigning heavily armed shotgun messengers to protect valuable cargo, and for particularly important shipments, even armored coaches to resist attacks. And we can't forget encounters with Native Americans, a complex aspect of history and cinema. Hollywood, with its aim to dramatize stories, created one of the most severe historical distortions. In films, Native Americans were often portrayed as cruel villains, constantly carrying out relentless, brutal, and unprovoked attacks on stagecoaches. However, the multi-dimensional reality was completely different. Attacks did occur and could be very frightening. Their danger cannot be denied. However, the motives for these attacks were often complex, not simply instinctive brutality. Native Americans might attack to steal horses or mules, which were extremely valuable assets to them. Or it could be an act of resistance against the encroachment of white settlers onto their ancestral lands. Sometimes, it was retaliation for violent or deceptive acts by white people, or simply to secure vital resources. In many cases, the damage was primarily to livestock and property, not passenger casualties. The frequency and nature of attacks were also often exaggerated or misattributed in folklore and films. Indeed, some crimes blamed on Native American tribes were actually carried out by white men in disguise to instill fear or serve their own purposes. While the fear of such encounters was real and completely justified for stagecoach travelers, understanding the historical context of land and resource dispossession is crucial, completely different from the simplistic savage Indian stereotypes Hollywood constructed. Nevertheless, contrary to Hollywood's romanticization, Native American stagecoach attacks did often occur in reality, not just in the fiction of novelists and filmmakers. Many attacks are documented, often targeting horses for property or revenge, not necessarily for monetary gain. These attacks could involve dramatic chases, similar to what we see in Hollywood films. For example, the attack on George H. Giddings's coach by 50 Mescalero Apaches in West Texas in 1854 led to a battle that lasted until sunset, wounding both passengers and horses. Another attack by Chiricahua Chief Cochise in 1861 killed the guide and driver, overturning the coach. A more horrifying attack in 1861 by 150 Apache warriors under Mangus Coloradas and Cochise left 4 dead in a makeshift fortification, with bodies stripped, arms broken, and heads full of bullets. Native Americans sometimes used clever ambush tactics, such as hiding behind sagebrush, to execute sudden and effective attacks. Attacks often caused significant loss of life and property, leading to heavy losses for stagecoach companies. However, it should be noted that in many cases, Native Americans often suffered more casualties than the better-armed defenders. Which of these stagecoach dangers, from accidents and illnesses to encounters with Native Americans, surprised you the most? Share your thoughts on what aspect of this reality Hollywood overlooked in the comments. The human element. Passengers and crew. After all the harsh conditions and potential dangers, the human element, the psychology of passengers, social dynamics, and the lives of the crew, was a crucial part of the complete picture of the brutal reality of stagecoach travel. The mental and emotional burden on passengers was immense. They faced acute fear of attacks, accidents, or illness, keeping them in a constant state of high alert. Interspersed with the terror were long stretches of mind-numbingly monotonous and boring road, where the cramped space and repetitive scenery made time drag endlessly. Overarching it all was pervasive fatigue, a profound state of exhaustion from continuous non-stop movement, chronic sleep deprivation, poor food, and prolonged nervous tension. The awareness of ever-present dangers weighed heavily on their minds, making every moment a test of endurance. Social dynamics in this cramped space were also very unique. The forced intimacy in an extremely tight coach compartment with complete strangers, sometimes for days on end, often led to conflicts. To maintain order and minimize tension, major stagecoach companies like Wells Fargo had to establish strict rules of conduct for passengers. These rules were part of the unwritten laws for passengers to survive and coexist peacefully. Let's look at some interesting and sometimes humorous rules that clearly reflected reality. Share your liquor. A reminder of the importance of generosity and community spirit in difficult circumstances. Spit with the wind. A simple yet extremely necessary hygiene rule to avoid bothering fellow travelers. Don't snore on your companions. While it might sound funny, in a confined space, snoring could be a torment for others. Be courteous to women, emphasizing the need for social norms, especially when women were often a minority and vulnerable on these journeys. Keep calm in cases of runaway coaches. A practical piece of advice to avoid panic, which could worsen the situation. Specifically, the rules also advised, don't discuss politics or religion, topics prone to controversy and conflict. There was also advice to refrain from using profane language to maintain a civilized atmosphere in the coach. And a very notable rule was, don't point out locations where Native American attacks or stagecoach robberies occurred, to avoid instilling more fear and anxiety in passengers. These rules highlight the potential for disorder and the necessity of controlling behavior in the stressful environment of a stagecoach. Beyond the passengers, the lives of the stagecoach crew were also incredibly arduous and dangerous. Drivers, also known as whips, were respected for their skillful mastery of handling multiple horse teams on dangerous, challenging roads. However, they also faced constant danger, terribly long working hours, and often low pay. The pressure to keep the coach on schedule and safe was immense. Shotgun messengers were the protectors of valuable cargo, an extremely dangerous job as they were often the first targets of robbers. They had to ride on the roof of the coach or beside the driver, always ready for a fight. These individuals bore disproportionate risks compared to the meager rewards they received, often being the unsung heroes of the West. Finally, stagecoach passengers were a diverse cross-section of contemporary society. They came from all walks of life and professions: soldiers, clergy, scholars, servants, aristocrats, and even those seeking new fortunes. Although passengers contributed to revenue, mail and money were the main drivers, the lifeblood of stagecoach companies. People traveled for various reasons: business, migrating to new lands, seeking better health, or simply for the adventurous spirit of exploring the Wild West. Each passenger was a story, a piece in the larger tapestry of America's expansion. 19th-century American stagecoach travel is a clear example of the chasm between popular myth and historical reality. Hollywood painted an exciting, romantic picture. Historical records reveal an experience that was incredibly brutal, immensely uncomfortable, dangerous, and horrifyingly unsanitary. The true story is one of incredible human endurance, of passengers and crew who bravely withstood unimaginable conditions. The extraordinary stamina required makes the westward expansion far more impressive than Hollywood's sanitized versions. What were Wild West saloons actually like? Far from the slick Hollywood scenes, these were dusty, rowdy joints where deals were made, tempers flared, and communities came alive. From makeshift shacks to raucous gathering spots, saloons were the social engine of the frontier. So pour yourself a drink. We're stepping into the real story behind the swinging doors. Myth versus reality. The image of a Wild West saloon is instantly recognizable. Swinging doors, a long wooden bar, and perhaps a poker game in progress. It's a potent symbol of frontier life, ingrained in our minds by countless movies and stories. But while saloons certainly played a key role in the Old West, the Hollywood version often obscures the reality of these establishments. They were far more than just backdrops for gunfights and gambling. They were vital community hubs, serving a variety of crucial functions. While the occasional brawl or scandal undoubtedly occurred, these were exceptions, not the rule. The everyday life of a saloon was often much more mundane, though no less fascinating. Contrary to the popular image of constant chaos and danger, saloons were integral to the social fabric of frontier towns. They served as meeting places, post offices, news centers, and even makeshift courthouses in settlements lacking formal institutions. They offered a crucial link to the outside world, providing a space for people to connect, share information, and conduct business. Imagine a dusty, sun-baked town with few amenities. The saloon offered a welcome respite from the harsh realities of frontier life. It provided a place to grab a meal, a drink, often of questionable quality, and socialize with others. This social function was particularly important in a society where people were often isolated and far from family and friends. The economic importance of saloons also cannot be overstated. They were centers of commerce, providing employment and generating revenue for the town. They were also often the only place in town offering certain services, further solidifying their central role in the community. Think of them as the general stores and social clubs of their time, all rolled into one. The saloon keeper was often a prominent figure in the community, wielding considerable influence and often involved in local politics. While saloons did attract their share of gamblers and rough characters, the majority of patrons were simply ordinary people looking for a place to relax and unwind. The romanticized notion of nightly gunfights and brawls is largely a Hollywood invention. While these incidents certainly occurred, they were far less common than portrayed in popular culture. The real story of the Wild West saloon is far more nuanced and interesting than the stereotypes suggest. Gambling and entertainment. You've experienced the rudimentary charms of the early frontier saloon, the rough-hewn ambiance, the potent homemade liquor, the camaraderie of fellow patrons. But as you look around, you might find yourself wondering where the rest of the Wild West saloon experience is. The gambling, the entertainment, the refined atmosphere often depicted in stories and films. Those elements, while less common in the early days, emerged as the West itself evolved. As more and more people ventured west of the Mississippi, drawn by opportunity and the allure of the frontier, the demand for more sophisticated establishments grew. Saloon owners, recognizing the potential for profit and a changing social landscape, began to up their game. No longer content with makeshift structures and rudimentary offerings, they invested in creating more permanent and enticing establishments. The expansion of the railroad played a pivotal role in this transformation. As rail lines spread across the West, They brought with them not just goods and resources, but also a wave of new residents and travelers. Towns along the railroad lines experienced rapid growth, transitioning from transient settlements to more permanent communities. Unlike the often short-lived mining camps of the early frontier, these towns needed businesses that could cater to a more stable and diverse population. Saloons stepped up to fill this need, transforming themselves into multi-purpose establishments that offered more than just a stiff drink. They became social hubs, offering food, lodging, and a variety of entertainment options, all under one roof. They provided a much-needed sense of community and connection for those seeking to build a life in the West. As towns grew, so did the number and variety of saloons. Denver, Colorado, provides a striking example of this saloon boom. In 1890, the city boasted a remarkable 478 saloons, a testament to its burgeoning population and the saloon's enduring appeal. Just 3 decades earlier, the city had only a fraction of that number, highlighting the dramatic impact of westward expansion and the saloon's central role in frontier life. This growth and evolution of the saloon reflect a broader shift in the West itself. The rough and tumble days of the early frontier were giving way to a more settled and sophisticated society, and the saloon, ever adaptable, transformed itself to meet the changing needs and desires of its patrons. What would your ideal saloon be like? Would it be a rough-and-tumble frontier bar or a sophisticated, modern-day establishment? Entertainment. Once you'd finished your drink and soaked in the atmosphere, you might find yourself looking for some amusement. Entertainment options in a Wild West saloon varied, ranging from simple pleasures to more risque offerings. Some establishments provided live music, often a solo musician like a fiddler or pianist, providing a lively backdrop for the evening. The arrival of a traveling performance troupe, dancers, singers, or variety acts, was always a special occasion, drawing large crowds eager for a taste of entertainment from beyond their small communities. However, in many saloons, the primary source of entertainment came from the women employed there. These women often faced limited options in the male-dominated society of the West, and many found themselves working as dancers, singers, barmaids, or sex workers to make a living. Their presence added an element of excitement and allure to the saloon, but it also highlighted the social inequalities and harsh realities faced by women on the frontier. Patrons could tip the female performers for their talents or pay a premium for more intimate encounters, highlighting the transactional nature of these relationships and the blurred lines between entertainment and exploitation that often characterized this aspect of saloon life. For those seeking less risque forms of amusement, gambling was a constant presence in the saloon. The clinking of coins, the shuffling of cards, and the boisterous banter of gamblers added to the lively, often chaotic atmosphere. Men would gather around tables, engaging in high-stakes games of chance, hoping to win big, or at least forget the hardships of their daily lives for a few fleeting hours. Comment number 1 if you enjoyed the content above, and don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications to follow our videos. Thank you. Drinks, firewater, coffin varnish, and more. Stepping inside one of these early makeshift saloons offered a glimpse into the social fabric of the frontier. You might find a handful of patrons gathered around rough-hewn tables, engaged in quiet conversation, or perhaps striking a deal. A simple counter or serving cart served as the bar, where someone dispensed the often potent and questionably sourced homemade alcohol. Greetings were customary, and newcomers were generally welcomed into the fold. The clientele was a mix of working men, cowboys and ranchers discussing business, weary travelers seeking companionship, and laborers looking to unwind after a long day. The drinks themselves were a far cry from the refined beverages we enjoy today. Their colorful names like Tanglefoot, Tarantula Juice, Red Eye, and Coffin Varnish hinted at their often dubious ingredients and potent effects. Due to the scarcity of quality alcohol on the frontier, saloon keepers often improvised, mixing raw alcohol with whatever was available. Chewing tobacco, ammonia, gunpowder, turpentine, and burnt sugar were just a few of the additives used to enhance the potency or mask the taste of the less-than-ideal liquor. These concoctions were definitely not for the faint of heart. One of the most popular and well-known drinks of the era was firewater. This term, which entered common usage through interactions with Native American tribes, didn't refer to a specific cocktail, but rather to any strong alcoholic beverage, particularly whiskey. The origins of the name lie in a clever demonstration used by early traders to impress potential customers. To showcase the high alcohol content of their whiskey, they would pour it onto a fire, causing the flames to erupt in a dramatic display. This firewater proved the potency of the liquor, and the name stuck, becoming a permanent fixture in the lexicon of the Wild West. Have you ever visited a historical saloon or seen one in person? Share your experience. The saloon evolves, decor and drinks. As towns thrived and expanded, so did their saloons, evolving from those early makeshift structures to more permanent and elaborate establishments. Gone were the days of dirt floors and bare bones furnishings. Upon entering one of these newly established saloons, you'd likely be greeted by the sight of polished wooden floors and walls adorned with decorations reflecting the local character and interests. Saloons on the Great Plains, for example, might feature cowboy paraphernalia and saddles, while those nestled in the Rocky Mountains might showcase hunting trophies like antlers and bearskins. This effort to create a more visually appealing and thematic atmosphere demonstrates the growing sophistication of saloon culture and the desire to offer patrons a more immersive experience. In smaller towns or less affluent areas, saloons might still maintain a more utilitarian approach, with a simple bar counter and a few benches for seating. However, in larger cities, particularly those along the bustling Pacific coast, saloon owners spared no expense in creating grander and more opulent spaces. Large ornate mirrors, sparkling chandeliers, and other decorative flourishes transformed these establishments into showpieces of their communities, reflecting the newfound prosperity and sophistication of the booming West. These upscale saloons provided a taste of elegance and refinement, attracting a wealthier clientele and solidifying the saloon status as a social and economic hub. Upon entering, your gaze would likely be drawn to the bar, often the heart of the establishment. There, you'd find the bartender, a figure who often embodied the entrepreneurial spirit of the frontier. In many cases, the bartender was also the owner and operator, responsible for every aspect of the business, from mixing drinks to maintaining order to managing finances. They were the face of the saloon, interacting with patrons from all walks of life, dispensing drinks, settling disputes, and generally keeping things running smoothly. Early saloons, tents, and lean-tos. Let's debunk the Hollywood myth of the Wild West saloon right here and now. Forget the swinging doors, the polished mahogany, and the constant gunfights. The reality, particularly in the early frontier days, was much more basic. Those iconic images we see in movies and TV shows are a far cry from the actual saloons that dotted the Western landscape during westward expansion. The saloon experience varied greatly depending on the time period and location. In those early decades, you wouldn't find fancy facades, ornate signage, or elegant interiors. There were no boardwalks leading to swinging doors, no gleaming bar tops with leather seats, and certainly no top-shelf liquor. Instead, picture a simple structure in a mining camp or a fledgling settlement. Imagine 4 wooden posts forming a square, with a rough canvas tarp stretched across the top to provide a meager roof. Or perhaps just a hastily pitched tent, offering minimal protection from the elements. Some establishments were slightly more permanent, utilizing a simple 3-walled design called a lean-to, often leaning against an existing building or a sturdy post for support, with a single sloping roof like a shed. These makeshift structures were the precursors to the more elaborate saloons that would emerge later. Inside, the scene was equally Spartan. A single wood-burning stove typically occupied the center of the room, its primary function not cooking, but providing much-needed warmth during the harsh winter months. Forget elaborate meals. The stove was there to keep patrons from freezing. The furniture was basic and functional, a few rough, unfinished tables, or perhaps just a flat piece of wood balanced on a stump or a crude pedestal. The atmosphere inside these early saloons was far from the rowdy, dangerous scenes often depicted in fiction. You wouldn't typically find gangs of outlaws playing high-stakes poker or drunken lawmen celebrating their latest arrests. Instead, these spaces served as vital social hubs, fostering a sense of community and cooperation among the hard-working men who frequented them. Think of them as community centers, places where people could gather, relax, and connect with others. Many of the young men working in the mining camps or trading posts were far from home, without families or close friends nearby. The saloon offered a place for companionship, conversation, and a sense of belonging. It was a place to unwind after a long day's work, share stories, and forge bonds with others facing similar challenges. The saloon's role as a social gathering place extended beyond simple relaxation. In many frontier towns, these establishments also served as informal post offices, news centers, and even makeshift courthouses. They provided a vital link to the outside world, offering a space for people to exchange information, conduct business, and maintain connections with the wider community. The evolution of the saloon reflects the broader transformation of the West itself, from a rough-and-tumble frontier to a more settled and organized society. The early saloons, with their simple structures and focus on basic needs, represented the resourcefulness and resilience of those who carved out a living in this challenging environment. As towns grew and prospered, so did their saloons, becoming more elaborate and diverse in their offerings, reflecting the changing social and economic landscape. Social reformers. Leaving the saloon, particularly if you were feeling a bit lucky or unlucky after a night of gambling, might present a final hurdle, a chorus of disapproval from the social reformers who often gathered outside. As the West became more settled, concerns about the impact of saloons on society grew. The 19th century saw the emergence of powerful reform movements, driven by religious fervor and anxieties about the consequences of alcohol, gambling, and prostitution. Groups like the Anti-Saloon League, dedicated to promoting temperance and outlawing alcohol, became vocal critics of saloons, often staging protests and handing out pamphlets to passers-by. Their targets were saloons known for their rowdy clientele, their association with violence, and the presence of prostitution, the vices that fueled their campaign. They would often gather outside these establishments, shouting warnings to patrons and onlookers about the moral dangers within. Some reformers took their activism to even more extreme lengths, physically vandalizing saloons, often with a vengeance. Accounts of women wielding axes to smash windows and furnishings in an effort to shut down these establishments became part of the era's folklore. These movements reflected a growing sentiment against the influence of saloons and a desire for a more moral and sober society. While their efforts to curb the vices associated with saloons met with resistance, they laid the groundwork for future reforms and eventually contributed to the passage of Prohibition. However, in the early days of the Wild West, the social reformers often faced an uphill battle. Despite their fervent convictions and vigorous efforts, many saloons remained open and prosperous, serving a loyal clientele seeking a little respite and entertainment in a demanding world. Prices and no ice. Forget the modern luxury of a perfectly chilled drink. In the early Wild West saloons, beverages were typically served at room temperature, or even warmer, often hovering between 55 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice was a luxury not readily available on the frontier, especially in remote mining camps and settlements. Artificial refrigeration was still decades away, so patrons had to acquire a taste for lukewarm whiskey, beer, and those potent homemade concoctions. It wasn't until the 1880s, with pioneers like Adolphus Busch implementing artificial refrigeration in the brewing process, that the idea of enjoying a cold beer became widespread. Once you had your drink in hand, it was time to pay up. The cost of a beverage varied considerably depending on the location and the type of establishment. In the rough-and-tumble saloons of the early frontier, those simple tents and lean-tos, drinks were generally cheap, catering to a clientele with limited funds. Cowboys, miners, and travelers often operated on tight budgets, so a few cents for a shot of whiskey or a pint of beer was the norm. However, venture further off the beaten path, and prices would rise accordingly. In remote regions like the Yukon Territory, where supplies were harder to come by, a single shot of whiskey could set you back a hefty 50 cents, a significant sum at the time. This price reflected the higher cost of transportation and the challenges of getting goods to these isolated areas. In more established settlements, like those in Colorado or Kansas, prices were more reasonable. A quarter could get you a shot of whiskey or even 2 beers, though remember, those beers would be served warm. These fluctuating prices reflect the economic realities of the frontier. Supply and demand, transportation costs, and the local market all played a role in determining the price of a drink. Even the very first recorded saloon, known as Brown's Hole, located near the present-day borders of Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah, likely operated on these principles. Established in 1822, this frontier outpost served trappers and fur traders, offering a brief respite from the rigors of their work. While the specific prices at Brown's Hole remain a mystery, it's safe to assume they reflected the financial constraints of their clientele and the challenges of operating a business in such a remote and unforgiving environment. Saloons as community centers. As towns and cities sprang up across the West, saloons became more than just places to grab a drink. They evolved into vital community centers, fulfilling a variety of social functions. Their central location in burgeoning towns wasn't just a strategic business decision. It reflected their role as gathering places for people from all walks of life. In many frontier communities, saloons were the only establishments large and versatile enough to host town meetings, elections, and even religious services. They filled a void, providing space and resources that were often lacking in these newly established settlements. It wasn't unusual for saloons to close their doors to regular business on Sunday mornings, making way for traveling preachers to hold sermons and services. This practice highlights the saloon's adaptability and its importance to communities that often lacked dedicated churches or meeting halls. They served as informal town squares where civic matters were debated, decisions were made, and social connections were forged. Saloons also provided a platform for economic opportunity. Some functioned as makeshift employment agencies, hosting job fairs where employers could connect with potential workers, a vital service in a region experiencing rapid growth and attracting fortune seekers from far and wide. Some enterprising saloon owners expanded their services even further, incorporating lodging and trading posts into their businesses. These multifaceted establishments became true community hubs, offering a wide range of goods and services under one roof, catering to the diverse needs of frontier communities. While saloons generally welcomed patrons from all walks of life, the social and racial prejudices of the time were also reflected in these establishments. In some areas, particularly in former Confederate states like Texas, segregated saloons emerged, catering to specific racial demographics. However, as you ventured further west, this segregation became less prevalent, perhaps reflecting the more fluid and integrated nature of frontier society in those regions. The saloon, in many ways, served as a microcosm of the evolving social landscape of the West. It reflected both the inclusive spirit of frontier communities and the persistent divisions that shaped American society at the time. No bar stools and communal towels. Yuck. Now picture yourself at the bar, ready to enjoy your drink. Instinctively, you reach for the bar stool. But wait. You'll quickly find that classic saloons lacked this modern convenience. Instead of bar stools, most establishments featured a long metal foot rail running along the base of the bar, a few inches above the floor. Patrons would prop a foot on this rail, leaning forward in a more casual and communal posture. If you wanted to sit, you'd have to snag a table, which might be in high demand depending on the saloon's popularity and the time of day. And when it came time to wipe the foam from your mustache or mop up a spilled drink, forget about reaching for a napkin. In the Wild West saloon, hygiene wasn't exactly a top priority. A communal towel, often looking worse for wear, was typically provided, usually clipped discreetly beneath the bar. While this practice might make a modern-day germaphobe cringe, it was simply part of the rough-and-tumble reality of saloon life. These details, often overlooked in romanticized depictions of the Wild West, offer a glimpse into the practicalities and, let's be honest, sometimes less than sanitary aspects of everyday life in these establishments. Faro and other games. Faro was the king of the saloon gambling games, dominating the scene for much of the Wild West era. Imagine 13 cards from the same suit laid out face up on a table. Players placed their bets on a specific card denomination, and the dealer, known as the banker, would turn over 2 cards in a dramatic fashion. The first card, the banker's card, was a losing bet for anyone who placed money on it. The second card, the player's card, was the winner, and those who had bet on that card would be handsomely rewarded. Players could shift their bets with each round, making for a thrilling, unpredictable experience that kept crowds captivated for hours. While Faro reigned supreme, poker, in various forms like 5-card draw and 3-card monte, was also a popular choice for gambling enthusiasts. Roulette tables, a staple in modern casinos, did eventually make their way to saloons, but they were generally confined to more upscale establishments. The simplicity of the classic card games made them accessible to anyone with a few coins in their pocket, and they served as a common source of entertainment and social interaction. These games offered an escape from the harsh realities of frontier life, a chance to test one's luck, and perhaps win a little money to alleviate the financial burdens of everyday life. Bartenders, the professors of the saloon. The bartender was a true jack-of-all-trades, a pivotal figure in the Wild West saloon. Far more than just someone who poured drinks, they were often the enforcers, the entertainers, and the heart of the establishment. Picture this. In between serving up drinks, the bartender might have to break up a fight, organize a card game, or even step in as a bouncer, all while keeping a watchful eye on the crowd. It wasn't uncommon to find a rifle or shotgun stashed discreetly behind the bar, just in case things got out of hand. Bartenders also played a crucial role in curating the entertainment, hiring musicians, managing gambling operations, and overseeing the performances of dancers and singers. They were masters of multitasking, often responsible for everything from mixing drinks to keeping the books to sweeping up at the end of the night, especially in smaller establishments where hired help was scarce. Skilled bartenders were highly sought after, sometimes traveling from town to town to lend their expertise to establishments lacking a proper mixologist. In fact, some particularly renowned bartenders earned the honorary title of professor, a testament to their knowledge of spirits, their ability to craft a good cocktail, and their overall mastery of the saloon's operations. By the turn of the 20th century, bartending had become a recognized profession, with an estimated 50,000 individuals across the United States earning a living serving drinks. This surge in numbers led to increased competition and a drive to elevate the craft. saloon patrons began to enjoy a wider variety of higher quality drinks, from carefully crafted cocktails to imported liquors, as well as the increasingly popular cold, pasteurized beer, thanks to advancements in refrigeration. The bartender's evolution from a dispenser of rough and ready drinks to a skilled craftsman reflected the broader changes sweeping across the West. Saloons were becoming more sophisticated and customer-focused, and the bartender, with their diverse skill set and engaging personality, emerged as a central figure in this transformation. The legacy of the saloon. Saloons hold a unique place in American history and the lore of the Wild West, embodying both the allure and the complexity of that era. While Hollywood often paints a dramatic and sometimes inaccurate picture of these establishments, the reality is far richer and more multifaceted. Saloons served as vital social and economic hubs, reflecting the dynamism and challenges of frontier life. They offered a space for people to connect, relax, and escape the realities of a harsh and often isolating environment. But their legacy is not just about drinks, gambling, and rowdy nights. Saloons were also places of community, providing essential services, hosting gatherings, and even serving as makeshift courthouses and post offices in some towns. They played a role in shaping the cultural and political landscape of the West, reflecting both the inclusivity and the social divisions of the time. They also served as a backdrop for a remarkable era of American history, filled with adventure, hardship, and the pursuit of a new frontier. It's easy to get swept up in the romanticized images of the Wild West, where everything seems bigger, bolder, and more dramatic. The saloon, as a central player in this mythology, is often portrayed as a place of constant excitement and danger, a hotbed of violence, and a haven for outlaws and rogues. However, the truth is much more nuanced. Saloons were simply places where people gathered to unwind, socialize, and find respite from the often demanding realities of life on the frontier. They were, in many ways, an expression of human nature itself, a blend of the mundane and the extraordinary, the gritty and the glamorous, the community-driven and the self-serving. Let me know in the comments if I missed anything. If you found this real journey into the Wild West informative, please hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next historical journey. As always, thank you so much for watching.